the word trauma has always been very tricky for me, and I was trying to have this conversation with somebody yesterday, like how do you define trauma? And so could you just give us a little bit around that? And what I'm really interested in is as this as this is released from our body, what's that doing mentally as well?
Yeah.
Is something happening with like trauma release of the mind, or is that a different thing?
Yeah. Okay. So the whole field of trauma is like really being researched and studied right now in the medical communities globally. And so what they've been able to do is they've categorized them between trauma with a big T and trauma with a little t. Trauma with a little t are car accidents you might have. You might fall down on a skiing accident and break your leg. You could have an emergency where you have to go to the hospital because you're having an asthma attack. There would be smaller traumas that are not necessarily life or death threat. A trauma with a big T could be severe sexual abuse, violence as a child, any type of severe trauma like war, as an example. So it's big T and little t. Now, so that's dividing those categories. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that trauma only happens when you're confronting an experience where safety does not exist. So trauma isn't necessarily the experience, it's the lack of safety at the time of the experience. Because if there was safety, it would not have been either traumatizing or as traumatizing. Take a little child as an example. They're out in the playground, they're playing, they fall and they hurt their knee. If mommy or daddy are there and the child comes over and has somebody to cry and has affection with them, it'll just take a few minutes. That child will go right back out and play again because safety was there. If that child falls and hurts its knee and mommy and daddy are nowhere around and has to deal with that by itself, that would be more traumatizing because there would be aloneness, separation, isolation. All of that's involved in that, see? So that increases the event itself of being traumatizing. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then how do you say, well, is it psychological, is it emotional, or physical? Here's our problem. In the medical field, we've separated those three categories, but the human organism has no separation among those three. Everything that affects you, even my words, are affecting you physically, psychologically, and emotionally. Everything. Everything you do affects your psyche and your emotions. So you could do something to the body, it affects the psyche and the emotions. I could yell at you, not touch your body at all, but your body will react to that. So you see, it does not separate those three. We separated them to research them better and understand them better. But in that process, we actually kept them separate. We have to bring them back together and say the human organism does not function that way.
Gotcha. Fascinating. And instinctively, that from my lay perspective makes so much sense as well, that we're just this one unit. Here's one for you. Crying. What is, because I come from a family where we do not cry, we suppress it, and every now and again it will sneak out. So what's going on there? Is that part of your work? Have you seen anything here?
I love that it'll sneak out. I'm telling you, the body's determined it's going to come back to life. If I were able to choose in the English language what two words to get rid of, one would be laughing and one would be crying.
Oh.
The reason I would get rid of those words is because they're so pejorative. One is one we favor and the other one suggests weakness, vulnerability, etc. Both of those are nothing but diaphragm pulsation. See, laughing is when the diaphragm starts to move itself. That's what creates the sensation of laughter. Crying is when the diaphragm starts to move itself. That's what creates the sensation of crying.
Yeah.
Now, you could cry and laugh and not know what's going on. I don't know whether I'm laughing or crying. You could watch a TV show and cry. You could sob your eyes out watching a sad movie on TV, even though you know it's fake. I mean, look at all those movies that we have that are designed to do what? Evoke one of two emotions. fear, crying, sadness, etc., or happiness, joy, and pleasure. That's what all movies are designed around. And so to the human organism, it does not make the distinction whether that pulsation is laughing or crying. It just knows, uh-oh, something's tight and it needs to release. And sort of like a little bit like an earthquake. Laughing and crying is basically the diaphragm pulsating itself, even against our will, which is really interesting. I love it when you're in church, as an example, or synagogue or whatever, and you're not allowed to laugh, but something strikes you funny. And what do you have to do? You have to hold that earthquake from exploding out of you, see? Yeah. And so laughing and crying is, which I love, the beautiful breath work you're doing, is trying to free the diaphragm up enough so that if it does need to pulsate itself under these descriptions of laughing and crying, it is free to do so. I think the worst thing that's happened to the male population is don't cry. You're weak, you're vulnerable, and this is really sad. You're like a little girl. I heard that all the time when I was growing up. And so women actually are allowed to cry. It's not necessarily seen as a good thing, but at least they're free to do it. Men are not free to cry at all, ever. No. And so could you imagine living in a male human structure where you're denied the need of letting your diaphragm move itself freely? Yeah. And then you're told to be a man. There's a complication in this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's watching my little boy. He's just turned 6 months,